There are moments in life that arrive without warning, quiet, ordinary moments that somehow carry the weight of everything you've ever kept secret. A phone ringing on a cold afternoon. A friend's name appearing on your screen. A simple greeting that feels completely normal right up until the second it doesn't. And then, before you've even had the chance to brace yourself, the ground shifts beneath your feet. The thing you buried years ago, the thing you convinced yourself no longer mattered, that time had quietly taken care of, it surfaces. And it looks you directly in the eye. That is exactly what happened to the man telling this first story. He received a phone call he thought would be cheerful and simple. A friendly catch-up. A bit of holiday warmth from people he cared deeply about. He picked up the phone with a smile already forming on his face, completely unprepared for what was waiting for him on the other end. Because what he heard instead was the kind of news that reaches into your chest and squeezes. His oldest friend was gone, not dead, but missing. Vanished into the cold Scottish countryside without a proper explanation. And the only clue left behind was a single strange sentence that, to anyone else, would have sounded like the ramblings of someone who had completely lost his mind. But to this man, those words made perfect sense. Because he alone knew the truth. He alone knew exactly where his friend had gone. And more importantly, he alone knew why. He was the reason. He had been the reason for over 20 years. A thoughtless decision made in his youth, something he had dismissed as a harmless joke in the moment, had quietly and completely reshaped another person's entire life. Their faith. Their sense of reality. Their deepest spiritual beliefs. All of it, built on a foundation that this man had secretly poisoned. And now, with his friend out in the freezing winter wilderness, grieving and desperate and searching for something that was never real to begin with, the truth could no longer wait. It had waited long enough. 20 years was more than long enough. This is a story about guilt and grief, about the things we do to the people we love without fully understanding the damage we are causing. It is about friendship and faith, about what happens when both of those things are put to the ultimate test on a dark, cold night in the Scottish Highlands. And it is one of the most raw and emotionally honest stories I have ever had the privilege of sharing with you. So get yourself comfortable. Make yourself a warm drink if you have one nearby. And if you are joining us for the very first time, welcome. We are so glad you are here. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story, because every single week we bring you accounts just like this one. Real. Emotional. Unforgettable. Now, let us begin. Just over 2 years ago, the narrator received a phone call from the wife of one of his oldest and closest friends. Her name was Sarah, and right away, he assumed it would be nothing more than a warm and friendly exchange. A bit of belated holiday cheer from her and her husband, a man he had known for the better part of his entire adult life, his dear old friend, Luke. It was the first Christmas season in nearly 20 years that the two of them had not seen each other, and there was a very reasonable and very heartbreaking explanation for that. Just 1 week before Christmas, Luke's mother had passed away suddenly. The loss had devastated the entire family. And so rather than spend the holiday season the way they usually did, filling every spare hour with laughter and conversation down at the local pub, Luke had made the very understandable decision to keep things quiet that year. The funeral had been small and intimate. A private family affair. And so when Sarah's name lit up on his phone, he answered it feeling genuinely happy to hear from her. But Luke was not there. And in fact, Luke was nowhere to be found. He had gone missing. Now, Sarah was quick to explain that it was not simply Luke's absence that had her frightened. She had expected him to need some space. He was grieving deeply, and a man in that kind of pain sometimes needs to step away from the world for a while. That part she understood. What she could not understand, what had turned her worry into something much more urgent, was what Luke had said to her before he walked out the door. He had mentioned something about talking to an angel. Sarah had pressed him. She had asked him where he was going and why, and Luke had only told her that she would not understand. That she would not believe him. She had planted herself firmly in his path and told him that she would not let him leave until he gave her a proper answer. And when Luke finally replied, when he looked her in the eyes and said simply, "I'm going to talk to an angel," she had been so completely stunned that she had not been able to move fast enough to stop him. He had pushed past her with a bag full of supplies slung over one shoulder and walked right out the door. When Sarah asked the narrator if he had any idea what that could possibly mean, he told her that yes, he did. And not only did he know what it meant, but he had a very strong feeling he knew exactly where Luke had gone. And so he made her a promise. He would not just point her in the right direction and leave it at that. He would drive all the way up to Scotland himself and bring Luke home. Sarah was genuinely afraid that something had snapped inside her husband's mind. And while the narrator honestly could not say with any certainty whether that was the case or not, he knew one thing for sure: if they brought the police into it, Luke could end up in a very serious situation. Nobody wanted to see him spending 30 days locked in a psychiatric unit when all he truly needed might have been a warm embrace and a good long talk. And if he did turn out to need professional help, they could always cross that bridge when they came to it. But both he and Sarah agreed that the first step was finding Luke before anything else went wrong. And there was another layer of worry on top of all that, a practical and immediate one. Sarah had watched Luke packing camping equipment into the back of his car before he left. Camping equipment. In the middle of a British winter. The thought alone was enough to make anyone's stomach drop. Where on earth was he planning on going? Sarah had no idea. But the narrator did. More than 20 years earlier, when he and Luke and two of their closest friends were all somewhere between the ages of 21 and 22, they had gone on a camping trip together to Ayrshire, in the southwest of Scotland. They had driven out to a place called Loch Broadan, set up their campsite right at the water's edge, and then spent the better part of a few days roasting chestnuts over an open fire, drinking far too much, and quietly hoping the sky would crack open and deliver the snow they had been cheated out of back home. And yes, you heard that correctly. They had not gone camping in the summertime like most sensible people would choose to do. They had packed up and headed north 2 days after Christmas, because they were young and restless and full of the kind of ideas that only seem brilliant at that particular age. If you're new here and this kind of story speaks to something in you, please take a moment right now to subscribe and join our community. Every single week, we share stories that are honest, emotional, and completely real. You will not want to miss a single one. Now, the narrator will be the first to admit that heading out into the Scottish countryside in the dead of winter probably sounded absolutely unhinged to most reasonable people. And those reasonable people would not have been wrong. But they were young, and they were full of terrible ideas, and off they went. It did not snow while they were there, much to their collective disappointment. But they did find a chestnut tree, and to this day, the taste of roasted chestnuts takes him instantly back to that campsite, to the biting cold and the crackling fire and the ridiculous warmth of good company. It was worth every frozen moment, he says. The fire, the laughter, the conversation. They had vodka and beer in abundance, and they were keeping their spirits well and truly lit, in more ways than one. Because along with the alcohol, some of the group were passing a joint back and forth around the fire. Not Luke, though. Luke had never been one for anything like that. The only thing that ever crossed his lips was alcohol, pure and simple. Or at least, that was how it appeared. As the night wore on, Luke had grown quieter and quieter. He had not seemed sad, exactly, not in any way the narrator could clearly name. But there was something different about him. Something shifting behind his eyes. And then, without a word of warning or explanation, Luke simply stood up and walked away from the fire and disappeared into the darkness. The group called after him, the way they always did whenever someone stepped away, just a matter of habit and basic safety. They got nothing more than a casual just going for a walk in response. And so they laughed and joked among themselves, ribbing him gently and assuming he would be back in a few minutes. But a few minutes stretched into something much longer. Somewhere in the blur of laughter and drink, an entire hour slipped by. And then someone noticed. Luke still had not come back. That was when the mood shifted. Their mobiles were completely useless out there in the middle of nowhere. So they grabbed their torches and went out into the dark to find him. It got frightening at times, the shadows playing tricks, the cold pressing in from all sides, and reality starting to feel strangely elastic. The narrator says that last part was mostly his fault. And that admission will make a great deal more sense before the story is over. But what matters for now is that they did find Luke. He was safe and unharmed, and they got him back to the campsite. Everyone was exhausted by then. They crawled into their sleeping bags and let the campfire die down around them, grateful for the warmth and the quiet. And then, just as they were all beginning to drift off, in that still, dark moment when there is nothing but the sound of breathing and the wind outside, Luke spoke. His voice was heavy and a little slurred, but there was something underneath it. Something completely sincere. "Guys," he said. "I saw an angel out there." And they all burst out laughing. One of the group, a friend named Ben, teased him immediately, asking just how much he had had to drink. Another one was roaring with laughter, saying Luke must have spotted his Christmas angel at the bottom of a bottle. Luke insisted, quietly and steadily, that he knew what he had seen. But the laughter kept rolling, and before long, sleep pulled everyone under, and the conversation dissolved into the night. The next morning, they packed up their gear and agreed on a proper fried breakfast at a nearby cafe before making the drive home. They teased Luke a little more about his angel sighting, but he took it all in stride, the kind of good-natured patience that said clearly, "Fine, you don't have to believe me." The narrator had assumed that Luke might want to quietly move past the whole thing, maybe even feel a little embarrassed about it in the clear light of day. But Luke was not embarrassed at all. If anything, the opposite was true. Over the months that followed, the angel sighting became the quiet foundation of something new taking root inside Luke. He did not become preachy or dramatic about it. He did not push his beliefs onto anyone else. He simply became, in a slow and genuine way, a man of faith. His friends, the narrator included, largely respected it the way you respect anything that brings someone peace. Some assumed that when Luke talked about the angel, he was speaking in metaphor. That he was simply describing the feeling of finding God out there in the cold Scottish dark after too many drinks. But the narrator knew better. He knew Luke was not speaking in metaphors at all. He believed completely, with his whole heart, that he had seen something real that night. And that is exactly why, when Sarah called and said Luke had gone to find his angel, when she described him walking out the door with a bag of supplies and a look on his face that she could not quite name, the narrator knew without any doubt where his friend had gone. Loch Broadan. The same campsite. The same place where it had all begun. He rang into work the next morning and explained that he needed a few days away for personal reasons. Then he got in his car and drove north. He reached Loch Broadan by 1:30 in the afternoon. There was snow on the ground, not a great deal of it, but enough to give the landscape that particular kind of quiet desolation that only winter can create. The wind was relentless, cutting through every layer of clothing. He pulled everything tighter around himself and set off to find his friend. He did not wander the loch calling out Luke's name. Something more instinctive than logic guided his feet, and he walked directly toward the spot where they had camped all those years before. And when he arrived, there it was, a dark green tent, a dead campfire, and a small collection of camping equipment arranged neatly near the entrance. He called out, asking if Luke was there. The tent was empty. He could not be certain it even belonged to Luke, not until he found the Bible sitting neatly beside a rolled-up sleeping bag. Then he knew. For the next hour or so, he wandered the snow-covered woodland calling Luke's name. No response. When he finally gave up searching and made his way back to the camp, he decided to wait, lighting a fire to hold the cold at bay. Darkness had almost completely settled in by the time he heard the crunch of footsteps approaching through the snow. For a brief moment, his heart quickened. What if it was not Luke? But it was. And as he had already suspected, Luke was not exactly thrilled to find him sitting there. His first question, delivered firmly and with very little warmth, was who had told him where to find him. The narrator chose his words carefully. He was not there to lecture or to drag Luke home like a child. He was there as a friend, and he wanted Luke to feel that. So he kept his tone steady and open, and told him simply that Sarah was worried. Luke did not get angry. Not then. He understood that the people who loved him were frightened for him. But he made one thing abundantly, unmistakably clear: he was not leaving until he had spoken to his angel. The narrator studied him, quietly testing the waters. He asked him how long he had been there, which route he had taken driving up, what exactly he had said to Sarah before he left. Luke answered all of it with a calm and steady clarity. There were no wild theories. No paranoid rambling. No religious rants or distant, unfocused gaze. He was not a man who had broken. He was a man in grief, doing what grief sometimes drives a person to do, reaching for something beyond reason because reason alone was not enough. Then Luke told him the real reason he had come. He needed to find his guardian angel because he needed to get a message to his mother. The narrator says that sentence landed somewhere deep and heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. Not dramatic. Not unhinged. Just heartbreakingly human. Luke's mother was gone, and he was not ready to accept a world in which he could no longer reach her. And whether what he was doing was healthy or not, whether it was wise or dangerous, none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the truth. And the narrator had been carrying the truth for over 20 years. They talked for a long time that evening. They reminisced about the old camping trip, and then gently, carefully, Luke spoke about his mother's funeral, how small it had been, how final everything had felt. The campfire burned between them, and the darkness gathered around the edges of its warmth. And then, when the conversation turned to the angel, when Luke spoke about it with that same quiet, unshakable certainty, the narrator asked him one single question. How would Luke feel, he said, if he could guarantee him that he would never find his angel again? Because what Luke had seen out there that night, more than 20 years ago, that had been his fault. Luke laughed at first. He actually laughed. The very idea that this man, his old friend, sitting across a campfire in the Scottish snow, the very idea that he was somehow responsible for a genuine spiritual vision, was too absurd to take seriously. But the laughter faded quickly. Because the look on the narrator's face was not the look of someone telling a joke. It was the look of someone who had been waiting a very long time to say something true. And then he said it. The reason Luke had wandered off from the fire that night. The reason the world had seemed to bend and shift around him. The reason he had seen what he had seen, all of it had a single, simple, devastating explanation. Before Luke had gone off for a bathroom break that night, the narrator had added a tiny amount of LSD to his drink. He had told no one he had brought any. He had thought it would produce a funny reaction, nothing dramatic, just a little loosening up. But instead, Luke had walked off alone into the dark, and the world had opened up around him in ways that had permanently changed the course of his life. When Luke did not come back when expected, the narrator had felt the full weight of what he had done. He had planned to confess that very night, or at the latest the following morning. But after the terrifying scramble of searching for Luke in the dark, after almost losing him entirely, the confession had been swallowed by fear and then buried by time. He watched the remaining trace of amusement disappear from Luke's face. Luke refused to accept it. He accused him of making it up, of inventing a story just to drag him back home. And so the narrator began recounting specifics, things only he could have known. He explained that he had been watching Luke closely that evening because he knew what the dosage would do. He described how Luke had left the fireside early because the brightness was too much, how first-time experiences with that kind of substance often produced an overwhelming sensitivity to light and sound. He told him it was he who had started the joke about Luke sneaking off to vomit, partly to deflect attention from his own guilty conscience. He was in the middle of explaining how he knew the dose had been too small for a full hallucination when Luke came at him. There was no shouting. No warning. Just a sudden rush of motion, and then Luke was on him, hitting and kicking with the kind of force that grief and rage and 20 years of betrayal can produce. The narrator went down and curled up against it, saying nothing but I'm sorry over and over. He did instinctively try to protect himself at first, but there was no real contest between the two of them. On one side was a man who had been lied to for 2 decades. On the other was one who deserved every bit of what was coming. When the kicking stopped, Luke dropped to his knees and rolled him onto his back. The narrator thought for a moment that the punches were coming next. But instead, Luke's hands went to his throat. He tried to pull at the fingers. He tried to drag Luke's arms away by the elbows. Nothing worked. And in that moment, lying on his back in the snow, the firelight flickering somewhere nearby, unable to breathe, he had a horrible, clarifying thought. This is how it ends. Killed in Scotland, in the cold, by one of his oldest friends. He did not feel that he deserved to die for what he had done. But he felt, in some dark and honest corner of himself, that he understood why this was happening. He thinks it was only the thought of consequences that made Luke stop. If Luke had believed, in that moment, that he could have gotten away with it, the narrator is not entirely sure the hands would have let go. But they did. And when they did, the first breath he drew felt like the very first breath of his entire life. The I'm sorry turned into thank you. Because it was clear, unmistakably and completely clear, that Luke had just chosen to spare him. Luke was not finished. He was still shaking with anger, pacing back and forth, and he told him in the plainest possible terms to leave. To get out of his sight. The narrator wanted to ask if they could just talk, if there was any way through this, but he already knew the answer. He had never seen Luke like that. Not once in all their years of friendship. And so he left. He walked back to his car through the cold, carrying the aches and bruises from every punch and kick, and the deep, painful soreness settling into his throat. Then he got in and drove away. He stopped at a service station on the way home and called Sarah. He held off on telling her the worst of it for as long as he possibly could. But when he finally did, when he said the words out loud to her, she was so quiet for a moment that he thought the call had dropped. Then she asked him to repeat himself. He did. And she hung up. No anger. No raised voice. Just the soft click of the line going dead. That was the last conversation he ever had with her. He understands why they cut him out. He holds no resentment, not even a trace of it. All he can do is hope that one day, someday, they find it in their hearts to forgive him. And he adds something at the very end. Something beautiful, in its own quiet way. After sitting with everything that happened, after turning it over and over in his mind, he has come to believe that in some real sense, Luke truly did find his angel out there at that old Ayrshire campsite. And when it spoke to him, when it urged him to show mercy, he listened. If a story like this has ever touched something close to home for you, whether it's about secrets kept too long, or friendships tested beyond what seemed survivable, we would truly love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your feelings with this community. You are never alone in what you carry. Our next story comes from a woman named Allison, who is from Seattle, Washington. And she begins by saying that while it took her far longer than she wanted, she is finally ready to share what she witnessed, and what she was not able to prevent. For the longest stretch of her adult life, Allison had a friend named Chris. And Chris lived with something called persistent depressive disorder, a condition that had settled into him like a long, gray winter that simply refused to end. It had not arrived all at once. It had come in waves, each one knocking him a little further down. First he lost his job. Then he was violently mugged on the street, a frightening and traumatic experience. Then a serious viral illness left him physically weakened for weeks. And all the while, the relationship he had with his fiancée was quietly unraveling around him. By the time it was all over, Chris had nothing left to hold on to. He moved back in with his parents, up near Richmond Beach, and slowly, day by day, week by week, the world outside his window began to feel completely unreachable. He tried various medications. His doctors adjusted and readjusted the combinations, hoping something would finally work. Nothing did. And for a long stretch of time, he simply existed indoors, cut off from everything, retreating further and further into himself. But then something changed. In the early spring of 2019, out of nowhere, Allison received a message from Chris asking if she wanted to go out for sushi. They had stayed in touch mostly through being online at the same times, a quiet, low-pressure kind of connection that had been enough to maintain the friendship through his worst months. Hearing from him was not unusual. But hearing that he wanted to leave the house, that he wanted to sit across a table from another human being and share a meal, that was something different altogether. She said yes immediately. When they met, something about him was clearly lighter. He still carried traces of the person who had shut himself away for so long, she could sense it in small ways, but the weight that had been pressing him flat was visibly reduced. She was too relieved to question it out loud. But internally, she was already wondering what had caused the shift. Something had changed in his life. She was determined to figure out what it was. The very next day, she asked him directly. Had he started something new? Was he taking something different? What had happened? And Chris told her that he had found a support group that met once a week. Since he had started attending, he had begun to feel genuinely hopeful about life again. The group met in a coffee shop, nothing formal, nothing clinical. No circles of chairs, no scripted sharing exercises, no therapeutic jargon to wade through. It was simply people showing up, sitting together, and talking honestly. There was usually a brief closing word from the organizer, a poem, perhaps, or a small announcement, but even that was kept loose and unpretentious. The whole thing was intimate and completely without pretense. And for Chris, that was exactly what he had needed. Not another prescription. Not another hour of structured therapy. Just real connection with real people. The group was called Mother's Love. Allison found it quietly astonishing that after all the medications, all the therapy sessions, all the clinical interventions, what had finally reached Chris was simply the warmth of belonging somewhere. She did not take it personally that she and their other friends had not been able to give him that. She understood. Chris had needed new connections, with people who had no history with the version of him that had collapsed. He needed proof, fresh, living proof, that he could still trust his fellow human beings. Over the following months, she occasionally asked him about the group. That was how she learned that Mother's Love had no online presence and actively chose to keep it that way. They did not want a large, anonymous crowd showing up and diluting the intimacy of what they had built. Attendance was kept deliberately small and meaningful. Existing members were trusted to exercise careful judgment about who they brought into the fold. Allison waited. For months and months, she waited. And then in late December of that same year, an invitation of sorts finally arrived, though not in any form she had been expecting. When Chris asked if she was still interested in getting involved, she told him honestly that she was not sure about involved, but she would absolutely like to come along and see what it was all about. That was when he told her about the winter retreat. Mother's Love had reached a stage where expansion was beginning to make sense, and so each existing member had been asked to identify a +1, someone to bring along for a full weekend of camping in the countryside. And to make attendance as easy as possible for those guests, the entire weekend would be completely free of charge for them. Allison's first reaction was hesitation. 2 nights in a tent in the middle of winter did not exactly sound like her idea of a perfect weekend. But then Chris mentioned that it was more like glamping, luxuriously appointed tents, warmth, comfort, genuine facilities. She reconsidered immediately. He added that all the food would be vegan, which she was fully on board with, and that Saturday evening would feature an open bar, a free one, which was, she admits, the detail that sealed it entirely. She prepared herself for a winter camping weekend. When they arrived at the site on Friday afternoon, she was genuinely impressed. The facility was remarkable by any standard: hot showers, a bar that served warm food, a conference room that could double as a party venue. And the tents. The tents were not tents in any conventional sense. They were miniature structures, covered floors, heating, private sleeping compartments, and a cozy communal area furnished with soft, cushioned seating. The sleeping bags were plush and faux fur lined. They were also given heavy memory foam mattresses to sleep on. The entire setup was a world apart from anything she had imagined when the word camping was first used. She kept her questions about who was funding all of this firmly to herself and simply enjoyed it. Once they were settled in, one of the retreat's organizers came to invite them to the conference hall for the opening ceremony. About 30 people were gathered when they arrived. Chris moved through the room making introductions, and Allison found herself genuinely enjoying the social energy. She describes herself as a natural people person, and this was exactly the kind of setting she thrived in. After a while, an older woman stepped up to the podium and introduced herself as Mary. She welcomed all the newcomers, and then began to outline what the group would be exploring together over the next 48 hours or so. It was at that point that Allison realized Chris had not told her quite everything. Mary spoke for approximately 45 minutes. Allison does not want to recount every detail, but the broad outline of the seminar topics gave her pause. One focused on maintaining a low environmental impact, straightforward enough. But another topic was antinatalism, which turned out to be the philosophical position that bringing children into the world is morally wrong. When Allison asked Chris about it afterward, he explained that some members held the view that human overpopulation was causing irreparable environmental damage. But Allison had understood the group to be an informal coffee shop gathering, not a venue for intense ideological debate. Chris acknowledged that it had not started out that way. These were conversations that had developed organically over time. But there was still quite a significant gap, Allison felt, between a seminar on finding peace in nature and one whose title appeared to be something along the lines of the death march of Western capitalism. She had been expecting cocoa and nature walks, not political manifestos. Chris shrugged it off easily enough and told her they could simply skip the sessions that did not interest her and go on that nature walk she was looking forward to instead. But then she asked him about something Mary had said when introducing herself. Something that she had not quite understood in the moment. And Chris's response to that particular question was far less reassuring. When Mary had introduced herself to the group, she had cited a number in the 300s, followed by the abbreviation ppm. Allison had blinked at it internally, thinking huh. But Mary had moved straight past it without explanation. Chris now told her that Mary and many of the group's long-standing members had adopted the practice of describing their birth years not in conventional calendar terms, but in parts per million, meaning the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere during the year they were born. So when Mary said she was born at, say, 310 ppm, that translated to somewhere in the 1950s. Allison's reaction was immediate. She found it genuinely, almost comically strange. She was firmly on the side of environmental responsibility, she had no argument with that. But replacing your birth year with an atmospheric chemistry reading was, in her honest opinion, just a bit too odd. She said as much, and expected Chris to laugh along with her. He smiled. But only barely. And then she asked if he knew what ppm figure corresponded to his own birth year. Without a moment's hesitation, Chris answered, 352. He laughed at her expression and told her he had simply looked it up once out of curiosity and happened to remember it. But something about the exchange left a slightly uncomfortable feeling behind it. Like she had caught a glimpse of something she was not sure she knew how to name yet. She pushed it aside and went to dinner, where the social atmosphere was genuinely wonderful. The vegan Indian food was excellent, and the conversations around the table were warm and interesting. After more remarks from Mary, they retired to their tents for an early night before the following day's schedule. The next day was full, activities, seminars, outdoor time, and for most of it, things felt light and enjoyable enough. But then, before the evening's festivities began, Mary stepped up to make an announcement that brought everything to a sudden halt. She informed the group that the following morning, all male attendees at the retreat would be offered a very special gift. A blessing of Mother Nature, she called it. Entirely free of charge. It would not, she was sorry to say, be available to female attendees yet, but that was something they were actively working on, and anyone with questions was welcome to speak to one of the organizers privately. A ripple of confused faces moved through the room, mostly women. But Allison noticed something else. Not all of the women looked confused. Some of them already knew exactly what Mary was talking about. And that, in hindsight, should have been the first clear warning. Back in the glamping tent, getting ready for the party, Allison asked Chris directly what this mysterious gift was all about. He said he had been wanting to talk to her about it. She told him to go ahead. And when he did, when he said the words, her jaw dropped. The gift was a vasectomy. She thought he was joking. His expression suggested otherwise. In fact, as he explained it further, he seemed genuinely, quietly excited. He walked her through the procedure in calm, factual terms. It was simpler than most people realized, he said, requiring only local anesthetic, performed through a single precise puncture, with minimal recovery time compared to more invasive surgical procedures. He was clear-eyed about it. Matter of fact. And then he told her he was planning to have it done the very next morning. Allison asked him if this was a joke. It was not. Chris explained what had brought him to this decision. He said that what gave him the most peace, the thing that had done more for his state of mind than any medication or therapy, was knowing that no one else would ever have to come into the world the way he had. His parents had brought him into existence without ever truly considering whether he would be okay. Whether he would be happy. Whether he would be able to bear the weight of being alive. That was not a mistake he was willing to repeat. Knowing he could close that door gave him a sense of agency. A sense of doing something, even if only one small but deeply meaningful thing. She does not want anyone reading or listening to think she was dismissing his right to make choices about his own body. She was not. But there is a meaningful difference between a fully informed, stable, self-possessed person making a permanent medical decision and a man still in the middle of recovering from a serious depressive episode making that same decision in the middle of a camping retreat organized by people who actively encouraged it. She knew, with every part of herself that loved Chris as a friend, that this was not the right time or the right place or the right circumstances. She Googled it quietly and found what she had already suspected, that while vasectomies can technically be reversed, the reversal is major surgery. Full anesthetic. The original site has to be reopened. And success is far from guaranteed. She showed this to Chris. He was not moved. That evening, they drank. There was plenty of free alcohol, and the atmosphere of the party was genuinely festive and warm. But Allison could not let it go. She tried. She genuinely tried to set it aside and simply enjoy the night with her friend. But the thought kept returning, that the root of his decision was not hope, but pain. That he was not building something new, but destroying something old because he did not yet trust that the future could be better. When they found a quiet corner to talk, she told him honestly what she thought. She told him that he could not know what the future held. That he might live to deeply regret a decision made permanent before he had truly finished putting himself back together. She told him that once he was through this, once he had found his footing again, had his life back, was taking care of himself the way he deserved to, he was more than good enough to attract someone wonderful. That plenty of women would want to be with him. Maybe even her, she said. Because you genuinely cannot predict where life is going to take you. It did not become something romantic in that moment. But it was honest. And it felt, at least in that moment, like it had reached him. They hugged. He thanked her, not just for being his +1 for the weekend, but for being a true friend. For giving him something he had not realized he was still looking for, genuine hope. She teared up a little, she admits, though the several drinks in her system may have contributed. They went back to the party, had a couple more to lift the mood, and eventually made their way back to their respective sleeping compartments and went to sleep. Her memory of those last couple of hours is hazy. What she remembers with complete clarity is falling asleep that night with the belief that her friend was not going to do something irreversible in the morning. She was wrong. When she woke up, Chris was not in the tent. She bundled herself into warm layers and went looking for him, but the hangover hit her the moment she stepped outside, and she had barely made it a few steps before she had to stop and lean against a tree. Once she had recovered enough to move again, she set off through the camp. And something felt immediately, unmistakably different. During the first 2 days of the retreat, the atmosphere had been relentlessly friendly. Every person she passed had smiled and said hello. The whole place had hummed with warmth and openness. But that morning, as she walked through the camp calling Chris's name and scanning every face she passed, all she got in return was silence. People whispered to each other as she went by. They watched her. They would not respond to her greetings. They would not tell her where Chris was. The warm community of the previous 2 days had become something cold and wall-like and entirely hostile. It was not until she found one of the organizers that she got any kind of answer. The conference room, she was told, was being used as the surgical space. Through a large window, she could already see a small waiting area with a couple of men sitting in it. Chris was not among them. The young woman who had welcomed them on the very first day appeared at her elbow and gently guided her back toward their tent, saying they should speak privately. On the walk back, Allison kept asking, "Did Chris get a vasectomy?" The woman would not answer. Not until they were back inside the tent. Then she confirmed it. Chris had woken up early that morning, bright and eager, and had been the very first person to have the procedure done. He was resting in a separate tent and was being kept away from Allison specifically, because she had been identified as a negative presence. The organizer was the first person to tell Allison that she had been wrong to object. That a true friend would have been supportive. Allison's response to that, she says, was not polite. She told the woman exactly what she thought, that Chris was an emotionally vulnerable person who had needed serious professional support, and that instead of helping him access that support, these people had steered him toward a permanent physical solution to what was still very much a mental and emotional wound. And then she left. What happened as she was departing the camp is something she says she will never forget for as long as she lives. The day before, she had sat in a seminar about feminism. The day before, these same people had spoken at length about solidarity and compassion and human dignity. And yet as she walked toward her car with her belongings, grown men got in her face and screamed at her with such fury that she felt the spittle land on her cheek. They shoved her. They threw rocks. They told her that a real friend had already been arranged to drive Chris home, and that she needed to leave immediately if she knew what was good for her. She was shaking by the time she reached her car. She was crying before she even had the keys in the ignition. She felt that she had failed him. That she had watched it happen in slow motion and had not been enough to stop it. Chris has not spoken to her since. She has reached out many times. He has not responded. She says she is past the point of caring about the vasectomy itself, that is his body, and whatever he chooses to do with it is ultimately his own business. What she cannot accept is the silence. The cut-off. The way of friendship that mattered so deeply to her was simply taken away. She just wants him to know that she misses him. That she was only ever trying to be his friend. Chris, if you are out there, please call her. Now, before we continue, if this story has prompted any thoughts or feelings you would like to share, if you have ever been in a situation where you watched someone you loved make a decision that frightened you, and you did not know how to stop it, please leave a comment and tell us what you think. Your voice matters in this community. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, please give the video a like and share it with someone who you think would appreciate it. It helps us more than you know. Our final story this evening comes from a man named Alf, who writes to us from Sweden. He says that what he is about to share is the most terrifying experience of his entire life. And given how it ends, it is very easy to understand why. Alf joined the army when he was 18 years old. He was not drafted, he wanted to be there. He loved military life, loved the structure and the discipline and the sense of purpose that came with it. But when he was 23, a rare medical condition forced him to be discharged from service. It was a blow he did not recover from quickly. He mourned the loss of that life for a long time, and even after eventually finding a new routine, the longing for the outdoors, for the edge and aliveness of being out in the field, never fully left him. So he did what felt natural. He reached out to a few of his old school friends and floated the idea of going on a camping trip together. Most of them thought it was a wonderful idea, until they heard the specifics. Alf did not want to go camping in the summer, the way most sensible Scandinavians do. He wanted to go camping in the deep heart of the Swedish winter. The responses came swiftly. Most said absolutely not, thanks, but no thanks. A few said they would think about it. And then one by one, as the date approached, each of those dropped out too. By the time departure day arrived, there was exactly one person left who was still firmly committed to the plan. His name was Varius. Or at least, that was the nickname he had given himself. It is the Swedish word for wolf, and Alf says that single detail should give you an immediate and fairly accurate picture of who Var was as a person. He follows it up by saying that even knowing him for as long as he had, the reality of Var still managed to exceed whatever image you might form in your mind. There was a very good reason, Alf admits, that Var's relationship eventually drove him to relocate to another city entirely. The distance had probably saved their friendship. Because up close, Var was genuinely difficult, drinking and driving, getting into loud public arguments, losing job after job over behavior that was, to put it charitably, completely avoidable. Falling asleep at work. Drinking openly on shift. Getting furious when his coworkers dared to wake him. Alf would never, he says, have chosen to befriend someone like Var if they had met as adults. But the weight of a long history is its own kind of bond. And despite all of it, when things were good between them, they were genuinely good. They shared a sense of humor. They liked the same films and music. And they were both, at their core, people who felt most alive out in the wild, testing themselves against the elements, relying on nothing but their own skill and preparation. So Alf and Var packed their gear and headed out into the Swedish winter. One of the practical advantages of winter camping in Sweden, Alf notes, is the bears. Brown bears typically hibernate from late autumn through the early months of spring, meaning campers do not usually have to factor them into their planning during that time of year. As a precaution, Alf still arranged for some bear bait to be hung at a distance from their campsite, as an extra layer of security. He felt confident. He was wrong. They had gone out in late February, still technically within the hibernation window. But they were unlucky enough to cross paths with a bear that had woken up far earlier than expected, almost certainly because it was desperately hungry. In the middle of the night, they were jerked awake by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through their campsite, snuffling, searching, having already found and devoured the bait. They burst out of the tent together, shouting and making as much noise as they could, trying to drive it away with the aggression of sound and sudden movement. It seemed to work at first. The bear backed off. But then it performed what Alf recognized from his training, a false charge. It rushed forward just enough to cause a reaction, and Alf stumbled backward in the darkness and came down hard on his ankle. The sprain was immediate and severe. He knew it was bad. But they were fortunate, the charge had been a bluff, and when they deployed the bear mace they had brought with them, the animal retreated for good. The campsite had been partially disrupted and much of their food supply had been raided. Alf's ankle was in a very sorry state. He took whatever painkillers he had on hand, and they worked together to stabilize the campsite as best they could before getting back into the tent for what remained of the night. Sleep did not come easily. When dawn arrived, Var made a decision that Alf genuinely respected. Without being asked, he volunteered to go out and find a shop, somewhere he could bring back food and stronger painkillers. It was exactly the kind of instinct, Alf says, that kept him in Var's corner through all the times when the opposite instinct might have been to walk away from the friendship entirely. Var could be a source of real frustration. But when it genuinely counted, he showed up. Alf settled in with his ankle elevated and the bear mace close at hand. 2.5 hours later, Var came back. When he emptied his pack out inside the tent, the contents were unexpectedly varied. There was bread and bacon, reasonable enough. There were several bottles of vodka, a full carton of cigarettes, and a very large quantity of chocolate. There were packets of elk jerky. And there was an assortment of medication that went well beyond painkillers, antihistamines, antacids, stomach remedies, and more. A strange, random collection of things that immediately looked less like a deliberate shop and more like a grab-and-run. What struck Alf even more than the contents was Var's demeanor. He was not pleased with himself. He was not the returning hero he might have expected to be after such a haul. He was throwing things out of the bag with barely concealed anger, jaw tight, eyes flat. Alf asked where he had gotten everything. Var said he had found a shop. Alf asked why he had bought anti-allergy tablets when there was no one present with allergies. Var snapped, said he had grabbed what he could because he needed to move quickly. There was a pause. Alf looked at him. He already knew the answer before he asked the question. He had known Var long enough to read the expression on his face like a sentence. And so he asked him directly. "Did you steal these things?" The look that followed confirmed it instantly. But Var went further. He began to explain, with real defensiveness, what had actually happened at the shop. He had set his selections on the counter, the vodka, the painkillers, the cigarettes, and had come up just a couple of kronor short. He had asked the woman behind the counter to accept what he had. It was an emergency, he said. She could see that he needed these things urgently. What the woman had seen was a man attempting to buy vodka at 8 o'clock in the morning. She had said no. Var had offered to return later with the rest of the money. Sensing that this was unlikely, she had said no again. And then Var had lost control entirely. He attacked her. He beat her until she was not moving. He filled his pack with everything he could grab and ran. He had not stopped to check on her. He had not called for help. He had simply run. Alf was furious. And extraordinarily. So was Var, furious right back, insisting that he had done the right thing, that taking care of himself and Alf was all that mattered. The argument that followed was intense and one-sided in the way that arguments tend to be when one person's position is indefensible and they know it. Eventually, Var declared that he was done talking about it. He was going to get drunk. The situation they were now in was serious on multiple fronts. Var could not go back to the shop he had robbed, possibly the only one within a reasonable distance. Their mobile phones were completely dead in the cold. They needed to find a landline somewhere to call for help, which would mean Var going out on foot and searching through the freezing countryside until he found one. And before all of that, he was going to sit down and drink vodka. And then, yes, he intended to get behind the wheel of Alf's car. Another argument broke out over that. But Alf was in no position to drive himself, and they both knew it. He had to shut his mouth, take some vodka alongside his painkillers to dull the throbbing in his ankle, and wait. The silence that settled between them was not a comfortable one. They sat together without speaking, Alf eating what he could, Var smoking steadily, and the tension wrapped itself around the inside of the tent like cold smoke. Then Alf noticed something overhead. Through the bare trees above them, a small plane was crossing the sky. He did not give it much thought at first. But then, a few minutes later, it came back. And then it began to circle. Not in the distracted, wandering way of a plane that has simply taken a wide turn, but deliberately, methodically, overhead. On instinct, and partly just to have something to do, Alf started waving both arms at it. He did not genuinely expect a response. He just hoped it might dip its wings, some small visual acknowledgement that he had been seen. But after a minute, the plane turned and flew away without any signal at all. Var smoked and drank for another 10 or 15 minutes and then stood up, unsteadily, his legs working against the alcohol, and announced that it was time to go. Alf groaned inwardly. Not from the pain in his ankle, but from the thought of Var driving in his current state. The fear was already settling cold in his chest. And then he looked up at Var's face and saw something else in his expression. Var had stopped moving. His eyes were fixed on something behind Alf, somewhere in the trees. Alf turned to follow his gaze. A man was walking toward them through the snow. He was holding what appeared to be a shotgun. Var did not hesitate. The moment he saw the man, he yelled a single word, "Run," and bolted. He ran as fast as he could in the opposite direction, crashing through the trees with no plan beyond putting distance between himself and the gun. Alf tried to run too. But his ankle would not hold his weight. He heard the first shot ring out across the frozen landscape and, instinctively, he threw himself to the ground the way his training had taught him to, flat, face down, minimizing the target. The impact of the fall shot agony straight through his ankle. He tried to get up. He fell again. He tried to crawl. But he was not moving fast enough, and he knew it. So he did the only thing left available to him. He rolled onto his back. He raised his hands. He looked directly at the man approaching him and begged for his life. He understood, even in that moment of terror, exactly who this man was. This was the husband of the woman Var had beaten in that shop. He had seen the plane circling. He had found them. And now he was here, shotgun raised, with every reason in the world to be the angriest man alive. Alf spoke quickly and clearly. He told the man it had not been him. That he had been injured in the tent when it happened, that he had known nothing about it until his friend came back, and that he wanted nothing more than to make things right. He could tell, from the way the man's eyes moved, the way they tracked toward where Var had fled, that he had already been given a description of who he was looking for. He loaded the gun and fired a second time into the trees. Alf heard no screaming. He did not know in that moment whether Var was alive or dead. He assumed the worst. And the man was now loading a third shell. The barrel came up. Pointed directly at Alf's face. He began to pray. He had not prayed since he was a child. He did not know if he believed in anything. But in that moment, with the cold blue sky above him and a shotgun aimed at his face, he said every prayer he could remember. And then the gun came down. The man reached out a hand and helped Alf to his feet. All Alf could say was thank you, over and over, from a place of gratitude so deep it had no bottom. The man introduced himself as Oscar. He told Alf that if he wanted to walk out of those woods alive, he would help the police find the man who had beaten his wife and left her for dead. Alf told him that sounded like a very reasonable arrangement. Oscar helped him back to his four-wheel drive, and together they drove to the shop, where Oscar's wife was being attended to by paramedics, and where several police officers were waiting for a conversation. Alf was more than willing to have it. Partly to clear his own name. Partly because he had made a promise to a man who had chosen mercy when he had every reason not to. And partly, he admits with disarming honesty, because he was fairly certain that if he did not help Oscar find Var, Oscar would eventually come looking for him instead. Var received a 6-year prison sentence. Alf heard later that he was released in 4. They have not spoken since. And Alf says that, on balance, he considers that a good outcome, though there is a corner of his mind where a small, uneasy question lives. A question about whether Var might one day appear on his doorstep, wanting to know why his old friend was so willing to cooperate with the police. If that day ever comes, Alf says simply, and with a quiet steadiness that tells you he means it, Var will not be walking away from it the way he walked away from Oscar's shotgun. What a night of stories that has been. 3 accounts that could not be more different from one another in their details, but which all circle the same truths, about the long reach of our choices, about the people we love and the ways we fail them, about the moments when something breaks open and shows us exactly who we are underneath. These are the kinds of stories that stay with you. That you find yourself still thinking about days later, quiet moments when something in them suddenly makes a different kind of sense. If you have made it all the way through this video with us tonight, we are so grateful for your time and your company. Please take a moment to leave us a comment. What did you think of these stories? Which one stayed with you the most? Is there a story of your own that one of these accounts reminded you of? We would genuinely love to read what you have to say. And if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and share it with someone you think might appreciate it. Every share helps this community grow and brings more people into the fold. Do not forget to hit the notification bell so that you are always the first to know when something new arrives. We are here every week with stories just like these, real, honest, deeply human. We will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.